Thank you so much for being here. It's a great honor to be in conversation today with two very talented and seasoned authors of fiction, actually. We have Devapriya Roy, whose latest book, Friends from College, is just out. And we also have Manjul Bajaj, whose book, In Search of Heer, has just released this September. Manjul Bajaj debuted a decade ago in 2009 with a novel called Come Before Evening Falls. It's a novel on love in the time of Khap Panchayats. Then she wrote Another Man's Wife, an anthology of 9 short stories negotiating the subject of desire. Both the books were shortlisted for the Hindu Fiction Prize. Her third novel, In Search of Heer, is a modern retelling of the famous Heer Ranjha folk love story. Devapriya Roy debuted in 2011 with The Vague Woman's Handbook, a novel about friendship between two women, both very vague. Then she wrote The Weight Loss Club, which was about a group of people trying to lose weight and emotional baggage. Then came a very interesting third book called The Heat and Dust Project, which she co-authored with her husband. It was about traveling across India on a very tight budget of rupees 500 per day only. She also wrote Indira, a graphic biography of Indira Gandhi, part fiction, part biography actually for children. And that book was shortlisted for the Crossword Book Awards and the Neve Literature Festival. And now comes a beautiful novel called Friends from College, which is a love letter to the Calcutta of the 90s. So let's begin with talking about the subject of writing about people whose stories we've known. You've written about Indira Gandhi and you've written about Heer Ranjha. So we'll begin with you, Manjul, first. That how did the reimagination come about of a story that has been adapted into films, stage?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I think the story of Heer Ranjha has been written over 100 times in different languages, in Urdu and Punjabi and Sindhi and there have been films right since 1928. Every decade or so, somebody's version of Heer Ranjha is being done. And there's a Pakistani serial called Ranjha Ranjha Kardi. So in this situation, why are you telling the story again is a question you might ask me. And it's really, these are archetypes. These are stories we tell ourselves again and again because they mean so much. At one level, the characters play out all of our dramas. That's why we go back to them. And I felt I had something to offer the English reading audience, the audience with a different, more modern sensibility. It's not the old black and white film kind of sensibility. It's people who think like you and me, but who are caught again in the same dramas of love and separation and a society which is oppressive to love. So that's where I'm coming from. I believe I have a story to tell, and I believe that the Heer Ranjha story was the right vehicle for it. So.
I think I was sort of an accidental biographer. You know, as a novelist, I had never really thought of writing a biography, and that too of somebody like Indira Gandhi. I was not, for example, a political journalist. However, 2017 was the centenary year of Mrs. Gandhi's birth. And that's when Kartika, my publisher, she thought that we needed a graphic biography, you know, like a graphic novel, like something like Persepolis, for the younger readership, younger people for whom today, I think, video or image has become a currency that they understand better than words, you know, rather than those large tomes of biographies. However, it was also a time when other biographies were being written, right? So Sagarika Ghosh wrote hers and Jairam Ramesh wrote his. So that was a second challenge. One is that we had to provide a context to young people to understand Indira Gandhi, everything about her, including things like the emergency. And at the same time, we had to say something new, right? Because a biography essentially must add to the existing body of knowledge that is there. And Indira Gandhi is somebody who's been who's inspired many biographies, right? Even more than Nehru has. So it was a big challenge. I think for me, the great thing was that because as a novelist, when I was looking at her story, the Greys fascinated me, right? And that provided an interesting angle, along with the fact that I was collaborating with an artist to create it in a visual medium, right? So Priya and I, as I keep saying that, our match, it was an arranged marriage. And the artist and the writer illustrator marriage can often go horribly wrong, and often fights happen. But we were able to work together to create a new language to tell the story, right? So I would do months of research maybe to write one chapter. And then I'd send her a really long and a really detailed chapter, which then she would subsequently turn into images and panels, and all the words would fall away, right? And I'd see that, how superfluous words are when all the details have been built into the image, into the panels. So that was a great learning experience for me. And towards the end of the book, I think Priya and I were collaborating better. So I was sometimes suggesting images, and she was sometimes suggesting dialogues. So it was really fascinating. It was immense amount of research, but I think the trick in a biography is that sometimes what happens is, for example, I felt this with, say, the Steve Jobs biography that William Isaacson wrote, Walter Isaacson. It's a really fat tome of a book. And I think what happens is if there is a great deal of information, then the person pixelates, then you're not able to see the person. It's too much information. So I think the trick was to get it just right so that one could hear Mrs. G, in the way she spoke, and also see her in the context of the times. Oh, and one of the things that I thought was interesting, the way Manjul mentioned, to make the story more relevant to today's readers, right? So you know how there are these American shows which often show the American president, and invariably American shows or American films will talk of the American president as the leader of the free world, right? So, I had a lot of fun with that, because when Mrs. Gandhi had gone to meet Nixon in 1970 actually, when things were very grim, we had millions of refugees, we were sheltering in India, the Bangladesh war had not yet happened, but it was a moment of tense geopolitical drama, and now that we have the declassified files, we know what Nixon said to Kissinger about India, about Mrs. Gandhi, right? And so there's a tantrum where Nixon and Mrs. Gandhi, of course, was absolutely icy with him. So that was great fun to translate that moment for a younger audience, right? And so we have Nixon throwing a tantrum and saying, who does she think she is? I'm the leader of the free world. So, so obviously leader of the free world is not something he would have said, but what he said is also pretty ghastly. He said that, these Indians, they need a mass famine. These are his exact words. So we use that, but we also try to update it to make it slightly, to make the story come alive a little more, right?
Right. So I'm going to come back to your latest works, both of your latest works. Both the books are very diverse. They have very diverse backgrounds. Your book is set in the west countryside of Punjab, and I believe your parents have a very strong connection with the place. And your book is set in Bengal, in an urban upper middle class family in Kolkata. And you've grown up in Kolkata. You studied in Delhi as well, but Kolkata is where your roots are, and you also are connected to your roots in a way.
Not really.
Not really.
I grew up in Lucknow, so this was really a search for a lost paradise. This is the land of my parents' childhood and the stories I've grown up with and the music that you heard at weddings. So it's really just a romantic project in that sense, that you're going back to the childhood of your parents and, recreating those images and those places that you've heard of, like Jhang and Dera Ismail Khan and Quetta, and imbuing them with the color of their longing and the color of your imagination. So it's really a search for Heer in very romantic terms. You're also looking for a lost homeland. And
Right.
so
Right. Right. So how was the writing process like? I mean, how much research did you have to go into? How deep did you dig?
A huge amount of research, really, because there are many, many versions of Heer.
Right.
And they have some commonalities, like the characters are the same, and the setting is broadly the same cities and the same towns figure in the story. And some incidents of the story are common. But there is a huge, huge, huge variety. So you pick and choose your way through the various narratives which suits your time and your understanding of where the characters are coming from. And over and above that, over and above the 30, 40 odd versions I would have read in translation or read about, there is also my sense of where the world is now. So you're telling the story. It's the same story, but with bolder threads, with a stronger sense of your time, because, you know, the book starts with a saying, the future has an ancient heart. So that really is my story, that everything we were, we project into the future. So it's an understanding of your past, but it's also an understanding of where you're going to. And so it's the same story, but it's a different story. Because each generation needs to tell the story to itself again and again. We need different endings, we need braver characters, we need better resolutions. So within the framework of the same story, how do you innovate? I hope you'll read to find out, because it's both a very original work and a work which is true to the ones which have gone in the past.
Right. And Devapriya, would you tell us a little about the Bengal you grew up in and the tidbits that you took away from your experience and you put them in the book?
In the book. So the book is now called Friends from College, but when it was being serialized, it was actually serialized in a newspaper, much like a lot of novels that I grew up with when I was young. It was called The Romantics of College Street, and in a way, it is a sort of a romantic project to reclaim some of the ideas that one had about one's youth. It's about a group of people who went to college, Presidency College, where I had studied too, and who now meet after many years. The idea, I think, of doing a serialized novel in itself was a nostalgic project, because I remember that, you know, when I was growing up, my grandmother was a great reader, and she used to read this literary magazine called Desh. It was very popular, in fact, in Bengal. It was like the New Yorker in Bengali. Of course, Bengalis will tell you that the New Yorker is Desh for America. But so my grandmother used to read Desh, and it would have a novel serialized in it, a very serious literary novel, mind you. And she would stack old copies of Desh by novel next to her bed. So if she wanted to go back and refer to an old edition, she would dig and pull one out and remind herself. You know, these would go on for 2 years, 3 years. That very visceral memory had sort of stuck with me. And when the Telegraph asked if I wanted to do a serialized novel in English, I said, yes, of course. I say yes, of course, to crazy ideas very quickly. And only later I find out how difficult it is, right? Even if it is a project drawn from things that are familiar, a book must, as you said, the future and the past must sort of, you know, be in conversation. It's very interesting that the generation of people I write about, people slightly older than myself, they are the ones who came of age in liberalized India. So they grew up in socialist India. They went to college when things were changing, and after some of them got their MBAs, they became the first generation of people who got 6-figure salaries. So I remember that when I was in school, the first set of 6-figure salaries made it to page 1 of newspapers, right? It's the peculiarities of that specific generation that I also wanted to capture. That who have now, so many years on, what their lives are like, and what some of the default programming of their socialist childhood is still in them. And then there are these layers that I wanted to explore. But it's also, because it was a serialized novel, you know, it had to have hooks. It was like a show. Every chapter had to end with a hook. So it was kind of fun for me. So what you said about, you know, you using the old story to innovate, I sort of felt in the same way that the framework of of the serialized novel provided that to me, where one had to innovate while staying true to some of these things. That that you had to make the reader want to come back for more. And that too in an age of binge watching, serialization, where you have to wait for a whole week for the next chapter. That was quite
That's
interesting.
quite a challenge, yeah. So we're talking about stories, we're talking about writing. As writers of fiction, I'd like to ask you, why did you choose to become a writer? Why not anything else? What drives your writing? It's a very generic question, but it's something that I think all the fiction writers struggle with, to come up with a story that comes really from inside. Do you have a routine? Where do you look for inspiration?
I think it's Huxley who said, I'm not entirely sure, but fiction is the lies we tell ourselves to reach the truth. So fiction is actually, for me, an engagement with life, for exploring the stories that you cannot, dig deep enough if you're just telling a biography or you're telling of events. So fiction is the construct by which you enter your own subconscious mind and come up with. So my characters always surprise me. They start off being my characters, but they're more than that. They're also the people who are going deeper into the mess, who are digging deeper for the truth, who are coming out with the questions that I'm looking at answers for. I mean, a lot of people have a very strong sense of audience. My audience is myself primarily. When I write to understand my life, to understand lives around me. And yes, the reader does come in later after the first draft. You do look at things like, is this working in terms of pace, or is this working in terms of drama? But the first story I tell myself, and that really is an engagement with truth. Different people go searching for truth in different places. I look for it in my own fiction. And what they say about the personal is political. Love has always fascinated me. I mean, I have never understood that how it's such a no-brainer. Love is the answer to all of the world's problems. Love and compassion and tolerance. And we are going all over the place, looking for highfalutin political solutions, and you're looking for answers to questions of gender equality and class oppression. Well, if you just turn the story into the home, or you turn the story into your own heart, that is where the real Mahabharata is fought. And if you have those answers, you can solve all of the world's problems. And if you're sort of saying, oh, romance writer or love is like a trivial pursuit, it's not. It's all there is. So that's why I write love stories.
That's great. And I think you're right that the first draft always comes from the heart, which is why you feel closest to it. What about you?
Of course, given that I am someone who has a terrible relationship with deadlines, my first draft, which comes from the heart, invariably ends up being the final draft because there's no time. Especially in the case of the weekly, because it was a weekly column, and till the end, they kept asking me that, do you know what's going to happen in the end? There are these two characters, and is love going to be the final solution, or, are all the other things that we've invented, careers, and are they going to stand in the way, I didn't know, because my characters were still finding out, and they were on the fence for a long time, and so I waited with them.
I'm midway through reading your book, so I'm excited to find out.
That what's going to happen, right? So I didn't know either in advance.
And like other fiction writers, do you also have a writing routine? Like Murakami wakes up at 4 a.m. to write. Do you also have a routine? Like I believe, Manjul, you go away to the hills to write.
Only recently.
Only
For
recently.
most of my life, I've sort of stayed in, chained to the
Okay. Well,
family routine, and I used to write early in the mornings, but now I like to go away because I can now. So.
Okay.
And it's wonderful. It's wonderful being sort of in a hut alone by yourself, and there's nothing except your writing to engage you. And but all of these books are the product of a domestic routine. The next one, let's see.
I don't know, I always aspire to be like that, and to say that I write in the morning, or, to know when I'm going to write. I'm sort of chained to my books all the time. I always think that when one is writing a novel, or when we were writing the Heat and Dust project, for example, one part of your mind is consistently tuned to the book. So even when you're doing other things, even when you're not writing, when you're procrastinating, there's some linkages happening in the subconscious. Something is going on, right? And I usually write to a deadline. So when the deadline is near, I'm writing all the time. At other times, I procrastinate for as long as I possibly can. I tell myself I need to do a lot more research. So I read 200 books to do research. I think each
Which
writer...
explains missing the deadline.
Terrible, yeah.
But a deadline is a happy thing. Someone's waiting out there for your work.
Well, yes.
I'm going to now bring in a completely different topic, the topic of digital media and book promotion in times of digital media. We have bookstagrammers clicking a picture of a book with a coffee cup and other things, a rose maybe. Now both of you are very traditional in terms of book promotion. You've had the regular book launches and then the regular posts on social media, but then we have authors who are really aggressive. They just go out and they have thousands and lakhs of followers. I have two questions. One, do you find it distracting? Do you find the act of posting on a daily basis taking away from your dedication to writing? And two, do you feel that you're lagging behind some way by not posting as often as others do? They're both contradictory questions.
It actually depends on what your goals as a writer are, and frankly, I find lakhs and tens of thousands of readers and followers and all pretty mind-boggling. For me, if one person reads my book and can tell me what it meant to them, that's enough. I mean, it's you become a writer by one reader to whom your book makes a difference. I don't know what the lakhs are about, and it's just it's very mind-boggling, all of what is happening on Instagram and Facebook. It's not that I don't do it, I'm not a purist, I do it because that's the world. But at another level of singing, ye kya shod macha rahe hain? What's the point of this? If you've written a good book, shut up. Somebody will find it and read it, and that's enough. So,
but do you like engaging with your readers when they write to you with a feedback?
Very much. If it's honest feedback, it matters a lot to me. In fact, that's the only thing that matters more than critics' reviews, more than bestseller lists, more than anything else. If a reader gets back and says, this is it, I'm going to get onto the rooftop and scream about this book to others, that's my aha moment. I'd written this story called Another Man's Wife, which is a story set against the Narmada Dam project, and it was based on a year I'd spent around the Sardar Sarovar project. And I have a friend who's worked with the Narmada Bajao Andolan for decades, and she found the book and she read it and she says, Manjul, kya likhi ho tum? And that was it. That made the book for me. If someone who's spent her life with that can come back and tell you that you've got the truth of the conflict, I think my job as a writer is done. Those numbers, I can't connect with them.
They don't matter to you?
No, they matter in the sense I would love to have them. It would impress my sons or something. It's not, but it's not something that makes instant sense to me. But a reader's emotional response, someone who respects you and you respect them, that's where it happens for me. I'm not writing for a unknown audience. I'm writing for people like me who care about writing, who care about the subjects that I deal with. And if they get back to me, my day is made. So.
Fair enough.
There's a chapter in Friends from College. It's called The Fine Art of Failure for Beginners. And the reason why I talk about failure is because I think one of the major drivers of the artistic process is that writers, artists, they're all a little in love with failure, And what I feel is that once the book is done and it's out there and you're writing your next book, you're all at sea all over again, And you feel all over again the anxiety that am I going to be able to capture the translucent and the strange thoughts that are sort of fragments right now in my head? Am I going to be able to bring them together? Is the book going to emerge from it? And that process is very intense, very pure, and has nothing to do with how successful your last book was, you know. So, in a sense, what drives you to become a better writer has nothing to do with, with your social media fandom or whatever, right? That said, of course, like Manjul was saying, that one writes to be read. And that's the great thing that social media has done. A lot of young people who have read the book then can connect, and you can tell them a few things. Or when the book was being serialized, I would get messages on Facebook and on Instagram and so on. But I think that where I don't understand how social media works is that because it is so much about success. It's about that moment, that perfect moment, you know, with the book and a coffee cup and a rose and whatever. It's an aesthetic picture. It celebrates success. It's obsessed with success, and that is essentially fiction, because what creates a book is sort of the agony and, you know, all the years that it might sometimes take when authors are not, you know, wearing nice clothes and are sitting and talking about their books. You know, they are in a terrible state, and that is the truth. That is our truth for very long periods of time. So I think, social media is great, but sometimes I could have like a whole tormented day when it'll take me 5 minutes to just go on Facebook and post something, but I'd rather sort of be tormented through the day but not go in there, because it's kind of cluttered, it's a lot of information, and yeah, it's, I think, a bit psychological.
Okay. I'm going to ask you one final question, since the theme of this session is the new wave. What is the future of storytelling? What do you see? I mean, where do you go looking for stories? And you teach at Ashoka University. You have students. You used to. Where would you go and look for stories? Would you draw inspiration from real life, or would you imagine something fantasy? What is the future of storytelling? We have so many non-fiction.
Everything, really.
Everything.
I mean, my next is again going to be not a retelling, but a delving into history.
Okay.
But stories are everywhere. Like my first two books draw very heavily on my experiences in rural development and across the villages and cities of India. So those were where those stories were coming from. My children's books are sort of a reimagining of the world. You know, it's our world, but it's not. You know, so it's and then now with Heer, I've gone into a retelling of a story, and so stories are everywhere. And even people who say they don't read, every movie you see, every serial you watch, somebody wrote it first. Yeah. There is no escaping writing. The medium may change, but the writer remains. Yeah. The writer remains at the back of the stories you're hearing. So
I think, of course, there is that thing where, you know, where I say that now there are writers, and there are writers whose books have been made into Netflix shows, right? So
but that's an ambition I have. I'd love to see one of my stories.
Yeah.
No, but I also kind of get irritated by it.
It's so wonderful for it for the medium that, and the story grows from one medium to another. It doesn't become less of a story.
Absolutely.
It just finds a newer audience. It finds readers who will come back to it because they've seen the show.
Right.
So new media gives us new ambitions as well.
And I think for me, you know, because I was teaching undergrads, 18, 19-year-olds, they were, for me, a great source of knowledge, right? Because, for example, language, it changes so much when it's used digitally. So, for example, one of my students, once she told me, you know, you end all your texts with a full stop. And do you know that in today's world, we think that a full stop is a tantrum? You know, so if you're using a full stop in text, you're being very sort of standoffish. And I was astounded, but I was also very amused. And I learned a lot of things from them. So in a sense, when I wrote Friends from College, I was also writing about friendship and love to 18, 19-year-olds who, by the way, all seemed very over love. They all told me categorically that they were post-Prem, okay, because in the college that we went to, Prem was celebrated and there was positive peer pressure to fall in love, okay. You may break up after that, that was fine, but but now they were all, oh my God, they'd be aghast, and then they'd all come, of course, with great curiosity and ask me, but what was it like? But it was the curiosity of anthropologists, and so in a sense, my friends from college was also a sort of writing for them. In a sense, I think, so for me, a lot of energy comes from observing and learning from young people, so some of my future stories certainly belong there.
My name is Suresh Tavani. I have a question to each of you. First one is to you as to what inspired you to write about Madam Gandhi. So I would like to know your thought process. And to Ms. Bajaj, you mentioned that the characters in your novels tend to give answers which you don't know. Now that's something I can't understand, because if you don't know the answer, how the character will give that answer? Can you explain this, please?
Do you want to go first?
Okay, I'll go first. See, there are many conflicts in our lives. And for instance, my first novel is a story of a young girl who is schooled to believe certain things. It's set in 1909. And it's really every story is about a conflict. So this is a conflict of a young girl who has been schooled to think that she must do what her family says she must do, and she must behave in a certain way, and she believes in all the caste norms and the Gotra norms and what society has brought her up to believe in. And then she falls in love. And the experience of love is so anti everything that she has been schooled to understand is the right way to behave. And from that conflict, I went in search of answers, that what is right, is what we are taught right about forms of behavior, what the patriarchy tells us is expected of a girl or a woman or a person, and what the actual feeling, that intensity of love, that madness of love, that opening of everything inside you, that the experience of falling in love is, how do you manage this conflict? So Jugni, the girl in the novel, is sort of looking for these answers, and in the way she behaves, I get my answers. I don't know them when I start. I know them when her behavior unfolds.
So your research tells you the answer.
It's not research, it's going deep into the story. It's allowing your characters to say, no, I don't think what you're telling me is right. If this is right, then how can I feel like this? And if I feel like this, why is it wrong? So it is the character who is questioning other characters in the book, who is questioning the entire social milieu, the conditioning. And in that character's answers, you find your answers. All the answers are not given when you start writing. So yes, some part of you knows the answer, but the other part of you finds the answer from the actions of your characters, from the suffering of your characters, from the triumph of your characters.
It's kind of alchemy, it's very difficult to explain, because I agree, and that's exactly how my process is too, that you find out by being silent and by being very closely, as though you're listening very closely, right, to that world. Now, Mrs. Gandhi, like I said, initially it was not an idea that I came up with to do a biography again. But then when I started researching her life, she's sort of fascinating for a biographer, right? One is that from 1917, she was born in 1917. She had a childhood which was quite tumultuous because it was against the backdrop of the freedom movement. Her father was often in prison. What that meant, the letters that they wrote to each other, and essentially a very difficult childhood because she was unmoored. Her mother was falling more and more sick at home, though her mother herself was part of the freedom movement. Her schooling was very scattered. She went to 17 schools in all. She fell in love. Then it was a difficult marriage. All of these things were of interest to me, right? And going back and excavating around that, and also the mind of Mrs. Gandhi, because sometimes, when we think, we often think of Nehru as the great intellectual and Indira Gandhi as somebody with an incomplete education. But she was in many ways taught from the University of Life. She was a great reader. She was a great, great reader. So, for example, letter after letter, the references that she has. And so it was a lot of research. And the more I researched, the more interesting things I found that I thought were relevant to young women, for example. How do you see a woman prime minister in India at the time, 1966, when she became prime minister? It was a first. For many of the things she did were firsts for women all over the world. For example, Betty Friedan, the great feminist, she thought that Indira Gandhi becoming Prime Minister of India was the first real break for the women's movement. And she flew down to India at the time, 1966. She did interviews not only with Indira Gandhi, a few interviews, but also with Morarji Desai, for example, the man who she defeated to become Prime Minister. And one of the things that I found very interesting about that long Betty Friedan essay is that when Morarji Desai had been advised that, this is the hot sort of time when Lal Bahadur Shastri had passed away and hectic parleying was going on in Delhi. Morarji Desai and Indira Gandhi had emerged as the two candidates. There were others, but these two were the two Congress candidates, and they fought an election. And at the time when a lot of hectic parleying was going on, the kind of thing that's happening in Maharashtra right now, a version of that was happening in Delhi. And, Morarji Desai was advised to sort of use as his offensive the lines that she's a woman, she's not going to be a good prime minister. And he refused. He said that when Mahatma Gandhi had led us on the Satyagraha movement, men and women came out like comrades on the streets. I cannot go back. I am a Gandhian. I cannot go and say that she cannot be prime minister because she's a woman. I will attack her other policies and so on, which was also very interesting. And again, Betty Friedan asks this question, that how is it that in India, which the West saw as a place where women were oppressed. Now, this is a typical sort of extrapolation. I'm not saying that it was, women had agency in India too. How is it that it was more acceptable for a woman prime minister, where even now in America there is so much animosity against seeing a woman as a sort of supreme commander? So all of this was fascinating. And it was years of research actually that went on. The other thing, for example, her interest in science and technology, all of that was, they added little fragments, right? And she's also very difficult. My father had been part of the anti-emergency movement. So that entire story is what I had grown up with. So even though it's a children's book, we have talked about the anti-Sikh riots, we've talked about the excesses of the emergency, all of it is in the book.
Yeah, if I can extend the theme of the talk, New Wave, a little further. Yesterday there was a talk on artificial intelligence. So I would like to know from the esteemed panel that how this artificial intelligence is going to pose a challenge for literature, or in general it is an appreciating thing which is going to be in future with literature.
Would you like to go with that?
Well, I think it's sort of, when photography developed, right? There was great fear that, what would artists, their role was completely, it would become irrelevant, right? Because a photograph can capture all the details exactly. So what are artists going to do? What it did instead is that in art, there was, a whole new churning happened. And if you think about Cubism or the way in which art evolved, there was a new response, there was a renewed response. So I think that that's what technology would do. I think the human story will always be, because we all tell stories to ourselves every day. When we wake up in the morning and we remember who we are, it's essentially a story that we have of our own life in our heads, right? We are going to always tell ourselves stories. We are going to tell each other stories. We are going to tell our children stories. So the human need for story will always remain. And I think, So I think writers will remain, even if computers are writing. I don't know, I somehow find it absurd to
No, I
imagine.
completely agree because artificial intelligence is actually, there was a Kafka's Metamorphosis was adapted into a VR virtual reality show recently at the Goethe Museum, and I attended that, and it was a very short 4-minute clip where you could become Gregor Samsa and be inside the room, and you could hear the father, the sister, and the manager yelling outside the door. You could see the rain outside. You could see yourself in the mirror, and that was artificial intelligence in a way, which was done.
In fact, I think, if I just can add,
Yeah.
I think the story is in fact the great resistance against the world that is going to be wrought by artificial intelligence. Because if you see, how does AI work? How does it come into our lives? What you see on your smartphone, if you go to YouTube and you click on one video, AI is going to then start predicting what you like watching, and it's going to show you more of those, which is how we are seeing polarization becoming such a reality that we all live with, right? And I think what Manjul was saying some time ago, that what stands against this is the individual story that challenges the norms that we kind of get inured to, right?
Yeah, it's lived experience versus conditioning. The story you've been told versus the story that your heart is telling you.
So we have scope for one last question.
I've been an admirer of the writing of Manjul Bajaj for a long time, especially her poetry. Recently I read a poem that you'd posted. It ends something like, Ranjha, Ranjha, kardi, main bhi ho gayi Ranjha.
That's the Kafi of Bulle Shah's. I've just translated it.
I was wondering whether your novel answers the question, what happens to Ranjha?
Well, read the book.
I think I compliment you for writing a book on Mrs. Gandhi when there's so much of criticism going on. You are a real bold author. That is one.
I'm glad to hear that.
And,
everybody told me, oh, you're writing a book on Indira Gandhi in this climate.
Yeah.
So I said,
so,
okay.
So
that
I
means-
compliment you at the outset. But there's another great thing which I would like to mention. I had the privilege of working for her for some time. And it was such a pleasure to see the sense of her art, the beauty, the kind of beauty she enjoyed in art and literature and so on was unbelievable. So I think that is another very great thing.
When she would travel to any sort of foreign country or whatever,
Actually, what she used to do was she will ask the National Museum to send some of the art pieces to her study on loan, and then she will really enjoy it. Even her museum is worth a visit and see what kind of, it was not gaudy, it was very artistic, all the decorations. See, the one question which keeps coming to my mind, and it's a very controversial question, you may answer, you may not answer. There is a lot of debate which happens about 1984 riots. And I have seen that. And I have seen the anger in the minds of people. It was not orchestrated. It was a spontaneous response which came out favoring and against her assassination. So I don't want you to comment on that. But
In fact,
another
we
thing,
have-
this is one which I wanted to make a statement about. The one about her interest in science and technology. So I was a witness to some of that. Perhaps it was because she was close to Professor Sarabhai, Vikram Sarabhai, her relations with Vikram Sarabhai.
and before that with Homi Bhabha.
Brought a lot of. Have you any point to mention on that? Yeah.
The anti-Sikh riots that happened, there is absolutely no way to deny the terrible tragedy of that. So what I wanted to include that testimony too. So in Indira, what we have is, in addition to her life, we also have a fictional narrative around it, which is set in contemporary India. It's about a little girl called Indira Thapa, who set an assignment in school to find out why she was named Indira. And the reason to have this framing device was so that we could include everything. So one of the testimonies, a real life testimony, is in the book. Of somebody, of Sardar Pal Singh, who was a taxi driver at the time, and his experience. Now, science and technology, we have an original story in the book, which has not yet been published anywhere, of how Mrs. Gandhi sanctioned our integrated ballistic missile development program. Kalam is the one who had petitioned for it, and he had asked for 300 crores, which at the time was a very large amount. And you know what she said? She said, okay, Mr. Kalam, I am going to think about it, but before that, you bring me your scientists, your brightest scientists under the age of 35. I want to speak to them, and if I see that they are impassioned and they are committed, then we will talk. So one of the scientists in that group was Dr. V.K. Saraswat, who then went on to many years later become the head of DRDO. So that story is also in the book, and this hasn't yet been published anywhere. I think, well, I heard it from Dr. Saraswat's perspective. So, yeah, so that was of great interest, her science and technology. Right.
Well, thank you so much for being here. You've been a lovely audience. Thank you, Manjul. Thank you, Devapriya Roy. We
Thank you,
have all the
Aruna.
books available for sale at the bookstore. They'll be signing the books, Indira, In Search of Heer, and Friends from College. Thank you very much.
Thank you.